a very exciting program, as almost every day. And I'm very happy to let my friend Jacobo Santamaria to chair the session. Just 2 words about Jacobo. He's a full professor of physics at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, fellow of the American Physical Society, director of a group which has had plenty of successes about physics of oxides and thin films during the last years. I mean, Jacobo is very well known for probably all the community and especially the Spanish community. So I wouldn't need to tell much about him. I would like, in any case, to mention that he has been visiting professor at the University of California in San Diego many times. He has also visiting professor at the Unité Mixte de Physique CNRS Thales. And I mean, he's a very well-known researcher in spintronics, and that's why I think he's going to do the best work as chairman today. Jacobo, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Thank you, everyone, and for being here. Good afternoon. I'm so much happy about your introduction. It's probably the best introduction of me that I have heard in all my life. So let me go straight to the talks. We have 3 talks this afternoon in a session which is entitled New Application, Oxytronics and Topology, right? So our first speaker will be Julie Grolier from the Unité Mixte de Physique CNRS Thales at the University Paris-Saclay. And she will be talking about basic blocks for biologically inspired computations. So Julie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jacobo. Let me share my slide. Oops. Okay. Is it fine? Can you see my screen and hear me?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so in this talk, I would like to introduce you to some fundamentals about neuromorphic computing and why spintronics is useful in this area. So, by the way, I don't know how it goes about questions, but I don't know if it's possible, but if there are some questions during the talk, don't hesitate.
You will, in principle, you will not be interrupted. So
okay.
All the questions will be collected and handed to you at the end.
Okay, very well. Okay, so as you probably all know, there's been huge progress in artificial intelligence in these last years. Now they have become commercial and their use is widespread. The most powerful algorithms of AI today are neural networks, which are, as their name indicates, inspired from the brain, so from the neurons and synapses of our brain. But these neural networks do not today run on physical neural networks. They, in fact, are converted into algorithms. And these algorithms are compiled into series of zeros and ones and sent to our current computers, current electronics. And because of that, AI today consumes orders of magnitude of electrical power more than it should. If you look here at this cartoon, you can see this computer called AlphaGo that has been able to beat the human champion at the game of Go. And what you see is that it's really a supercomputer. And the power consumption is like several orders. It's very difficult to compare exactly to give an exact comparison between what an AI consumes and the brain. But the brain, we know, is 20 watts, comprising all its functions, and a neural network today, state of the art, is going to consume, like we don't know, between 3 orders of magnitude or 5 orders of magnitude more. It's difficult to say. But what we know is that the main reason is the way our computers are made. In our processors, memory and computing is separated. A neural network, you can see them as huge mathematical fitting functions with a number of parameters that can go to billions. So what happens is that when you want to run a neural network, you have at each step of your computing to go fetch all these parameters in the memory, bring them to the compute part where you do complicated operations, and then compute new values of these parameters that you put back into the memory. And because of the separation of memory and computing in our current processors, this really consumes a lot of power. You can see in this small table here that the farther away is the memory from compute, the more energy consumption it takes to go fetch all this data. And so this is the main problem of AI today. And so now people are quite convinced that if we want to build low power chips that run AI as efficiently as the brain, we need to come back to a structure that resembles the brain in the sense that it's going to merge memory and computing. Because in fact, this is what the brain is doing. It's a network of neurons and synapses that are interconnected together. And what you see, so this is on the left here, you see a schematic of a neural network. What you see is that the synapses actually carry the memory, and they are directly connected to the neurons that need this data. So there is no data motion, basically, almost no data motion. And so this is why there is such a low power consumption in this kind of architecture. So, making a neuromorphic chip means trying to build an electronic neural network based on physical synapses and physical neurons, connect them all together and compute. And this, as I say, can really bring a huge advantage in terms of power consumption. So this graph here on the right is very interesting. It shows how much energy you can gain. So the vertical axis is the power efficiency of learning in operations per watt. And in gray, you have here the power consumptions of our standard computers, CPUs and graphical cards, which are used today to run AI. Now, if we were to make a chip using our standard electronics, so purely CMOS, you see that neuromorphic chips could help gain about 1 order of magnitude in terms of energy. And this is not so much. And so you may wonder why, because after all, CMOS is very powerful. This is because when you want to make CMOS neurons, even if a transistor is very small, in order to make a neuron, you need to assemble a huge number of transistors. And so it's going to be big, like hundreds of microns wide. And if you want to make a synapse, you need to give it some memory. And so for this, if you use CMOS, you need to use memories that are called SRAMs. And these SRAMs, they are costly in terms of area. And so in a single chip, it's very difficult to fit a lot of this memory. And so CMOS neuromorphic chips are limited in terms of the number of neurons and synapses that you can put. And so it limits their performance, because the problem is that if you, in a neural network, as I said, one of the power comes from the number of neurons and synapses that you put in your network. If you want to do image recognition, you already need hundreds of millions of neurons and synapses. And so this is going to be difficult in CMOS to fit in a single chip, okay? And so this is why you see the vertical, this pink column here, shows you that if you complement CMOS with novel nanotechnologies, you can gain really a lot, 2 orders more of magnitude in terms of energy consumption. And this is really because novel nanotechnology can bring memory, huge amounts of memory close to computing, and also very interesting features to imitate neurons and synapses at the nanoscale instead of having to do micron scale devices. Okay, and so there is a huge amount of work currently in this area, in industry and in academia. And this is because these chips, by gaining this enormous number, well, I mean, these 3 orders of magnitude in terms of energy consumption, could really solve a potential environmental problem of AI today, speed up their computation, and also unlock embedded AI. Today is very difficult to make chips that can learn and work on mobile devices. So now, how can we make these chips? What should these neural networks look like? So the most powerful neural network today is the brain. We know that the brain is composed of neurons and synapses that are connected in a very complex way, 3D, and it's a very complex dynamical system. Neurons are some kind of spiking relaxation oscillators, so that emit electrical spikes depending on their inputs, and these spikes go through synapses, and synapses are going to evolve according to these spikes, and they can be seen as some kind of valve for the information. And all this system has a memory, some analog behavior, some stochasticity, some oscillations. The neuron spike can synchronize, and there is a lot of nonlinear dynamics. And we don't know how it works. So how can we imitate it? Here is what we know. Biological neural networks infer and learn through spikes. So if you have, here you have a schematic with 2 neurons, and here you have the synapse that enables the communication between these neurons. So a synapse, really what it's going to do, I'm not going to go into details, but it's going to modulate the transmission of the spike between neurons. So neurons are connected in a unidirectional way through synapse. For example, you have a pre-neuron and a post-neuron. And so if we look what happens, for example, at this neuron, when it receives many spikes of other neurons, so these are the signals from other neurons coming through different synapses to this neuron. This, after the synapse, all the contributions of all pre-neurons are summed, and this results in a current on the membrane of the neuron. And so the neuron has a membrane potential. And you see here how this membrane potential is going to evolve with time. In fact, what happens is that it integrates the input signal. Each time a neuron receives a spike, it's weighted by the connected synapse, and it's going to induce a response on the membrane potential. And if there is no spike after that, the membrane potential is going to leak back and go back to rest. But if many spikes come after, you see that they get summed. And when the membrane potential exceeds a threshold, then this neuron is going to emit a spike. And then the membrane potential is reset. And then it starts to integrate other spikes that it receives through the synapse. Okay, and so here what you see is some biological measurement where you see the spike frequency of a neuron as a function of this current here on the membrane potential. And what is important to see is that it's not a straight line. This is a nonlinear response of the neuron. So the frequency of a neuron is nonlinear. So it's often said that neurons are spiking oscillators, or if you want, relaxation oscillators, nonlinear relaxation oscillators. So this is for the transmission of the spikes and how a neuron is spiking. Then in biology, what happens is that you see that the synapses are going to modulate the spikes. And what is interesting is that the spikes are going to modify the synapses. So a synapse is going to be sensitive only on the spikes of the two neurons to which it is connected. So the way these spikes are going to change the synapse is extremely complicated. The synapse is a very complex object with neurotransmitters. It really changes shape when it learns, so it's very complex. So there are many effects that occur. One that has been observed in biology and in the brain is an algorithm, is an effect that is called spike timing dependent plasticity. This is this measurement in biology. What it shows is that a synaptic change is going to depend on the timing between the spikes of the pre and the post neuron, and actually on which one comes first. And in fact, you can interpret this graph as some kind of causality effect. What people say is that, you see, the neurons are connected in a unidirectional way. So what happens, what you see here on this graph is that if the pre-neuron spikes first, and then if the post-neuron spikes after, then there is some kind of causality effect, which means that probably the synapse was involved in this spiking. And then what it means that probably the synapse should try to make this effect occur more often. And so when the pre-neuron spike and then the post-neuron spike, the synapse is strengthened, okay? And when it's the opposite, you have first the post-neuron that spike and then the pre-neuron that spike. Probably it means that it's due to the other kind of the other parts of the network. The synapse was not really involved in this phenomena. And so you want to decrease the synaptic weight, its efficiency in transmitting the signal. And so this is what you see on this graph, okay? But what is important is that really synapse modulate the spikes and spikes write the synapses. And the way they write the synapse is called learning. Okay, so this is a biological learning rule seen in the brain, but there are many others. And in fact, it is known that this learning rule, that is very important, called spike timing dependent plasticity, allows learning in a neural network, but it doesn't do it in a very efficient way. So we don't really know how the brain is working. So the state-of-the-art neural network in artificial intelligence are an abstraction of all these complex phenomena. They are static. First, they are an important feature before I go to the details, that they are, like in the brain, they are deep networks. So you have many layers of neurons and synapses, one after the other. And in the brain, it's similar. In the cortex, you have several layers. You have like 6 layers of neurons. And also in the visual part of the cortex, you have many different layers, one after the other. And this is very important because this hierarchical structure allows to process the information more and more in a more and more refined way. So for example, when a neural network does some kind of image recognition, you see that it takes the pixels as inputs. And as information goes through the network, it's going first to extract some contours in the images, then recognize and then specialize. Some parts of the neural network are going to specialize to recognize some areas of the face, like the eye, the nose, etc. And then layers at the end are going to be specialized to recognize faces, and so on and so forth. And so it's very important to have this deep architecture. And so the thing is that these neural networks, they do pattern recognition. So for example, I don't know, they may want to recognize who is in this image. And so for this, today, the way they are trained, the synapses are changed is by supervised learning. So basically what happens is that you put an image, you have a lot of labeled images where you know the answer. You're going to train your neural network on this data. And so it means that you are going to, when you put first an image, you are going to know the error of your network. And so you are going to be able to adjust the weights in your network. And so in order to do that, artificial neural networks today are really simplified compared to the brain. So they are static. The information that goes through this network are real values. So there are no spikes, just real values that are weighted by coefficients that represent the synapses that are also real values, positive or negative, that are summed, and neurons are abstracted by a nonlinear function that, in fact, somehow, if you want, represents the spiking frequency as a function of the input. And most neural networks use these very simple activation functions that is called a rectified linear unit. And so what neural networks do, the important operations are a weighted sum on the inputs by these coefficients, the synaptic weights, and then a nonlinear function. And the weights are adjusted externally according to a learning rule. And so high performance neural networks are trained through the backpropagation of errors. So what it means is that, as I said, these networks are trained in a supervised way. So initially, all the synaptic weights are random. You apply your input here. You look what you have at the output. You have an error. And what you want to do is to perform gradient descent. So you want to correct each synapse in your network, each weight, by a value that corresponds to its contribution to the error at the output. And so for this, you need to compute this gradient for each synapse, even if they are buried deep in the network. And for this, you need to calculate this gradient. And you do that by using the chain rule of derivatives to find this gradient. And then you can adjust the weight a little bit. And you show a new image, you compute the error, adjust all the weights, and so on and so forth. And what you see is that in order to do that, you really needed to simplify your network to have these static network and real value input, because you wanted to be able to know the functions and to know their derivatives and to apply the chain rule and so on and so forth. And so when you have a spiking neural network, very often the synapse here is going to respond to this neuron, and you are not going to be able to minimize an error at the output. And this is why spiking neural networks today are very far behind backpropagations in terms of accuracy. Backpropagation is really the state-of-the-art learning algorithm, but it's very difficult to implement in hardware because you have to compute all these gradients, which is very mathematical, and then you have to correct every synapse at each computing step. So it's a huge load in terms of hardware. So what's the state of the art of neuromorphic computing today? So people are building neuromorphic CMOS chips, and let's say there are some kind of tests for industry. So there are many different chips. I'm giving just the example of the Loihi chip by Intel, that is one of the most recent and efficient. So the Loihi chip by Intel is purely CMOS, it's digital. It's very low power. It's a spiking chip. It can learn through this spike time independent plasticity. And just a single chip can solve a very simple task of handwritten digit recognition. Because as I said, a CMOS chip can only include so many neurons. And so it can only solve a small task. Now, in order to build up the network, what CMOS people have to do is to connect all these chips together. So for example, you have here the Pohiki Beach. So this has 64 Loihi chips, and it can make 8 million neurons. And then you can put several of these things together in a big computer, and then you can have a huge number of neurons. So this may seem very cool. Actually, the problem is that when you start to connect together many chips, you completely lose, well, you don't completely lose, but you lose a lot of your efficiency because memory and computing are again separated. You have all these cables to connect the chips together, and you have all these buses, and this is where your power gets, you lose all your power efficiency. So this is why it's really important to use nano devices to emulate synapses and neurons. So most nano device-based neuromorphic chips for now rely on CMOS neuron and memory-stiff synapses. So the neurons are assemblies of transistors that are going, for example, to implement either a spiking neuron or just a nonlinear activation function. So the scale is about 10 to 100 micrometer. And synapses are made with devices called memristors, which are just tiny, non-volatile, tunable resistors. So a memristor emulates a synapse. The weight is a memristor conductance that can be tuned. And what is really very nice is that when you organize memristor in this kind of architecture that is called a crossbar array, directly through the laws of electricity, this computes the weighted sum that is very important in neural networks. You see that the current that flows here is the weighted sum of the input voltages on the top electrodes by the conductance of the memristors. So memristors really implement synapse directly. When the input voltages are small, they are not going to modify the synapse, so you are just going to compute this weighted sum. And then if you want to have a network that learns, what you can do is apply a larger voltage on the device, and depending on its sign, you are going to increase or decrease the conductance, so you are going to make a network that can learn. So this is the idea. So there are many challenges. Interconnecting all these components together is really a challenge for hardware. So when you make crossbar arrays of resistive devices, you have a lot of leaks and sneak paths. So the maximum number of neurons that you can connect together is 100 by 100. So if you want to do more, in the brain there are like 10,000 synapses per neuron. You need to connect all these little crossbar arrays together in a 2D architecture. Or you need to go 3D. So this is what people are trying to do. Here you see several crossbar arrays of memristor stacked on top of each other, which of course is extremely challenging. So recently, 2 years ago at IEDM, there was a very impressive result by IBM. They have shown the first neuromorphic chip that integrates memristor on top of CMOS and learns. So the synapses are phase change memories. And And this chip is working. It can recognize handwritten digits. It has, so this is really a very impressive result, but there are many things to improve. The success rate on this handwritten digit task is only 82%, which normally it's a very easy task, so you can reach almost 100%. And so losing 8% is a lot. Why it's not so good? There are two reasons. First, the algorithm is not backpropagation. It's a spiking chip. So it uses this spike time independent plasticity that I discussed, and so it's not so efficient. And also the second problem is the variability of the device and the noise that of course is complex. And so for learning, dealing with trying to implement high accuracy algorithm and dealing with the variability of device is a challenge. So this means that here we have requirements for an efficient neuromorphic system. You see that we want to have a large number of synapses and neurons, which means that we want nanoscale synapse, nanoscale neuron with a large density. We would like them to be highly interconnected, because then you can make larger neural network with more parameters, basically, and so they can fit better. We want to have low power device, low power interconnections. And also, of course, you need to solve your task with a high accuracy. And so this means that you need to implement a state-of-the-art algorithm and probably find ways to reduce the variability and noise of your device, or to deal with them algorithmically. Features that can make neural network more powerful in the future are dynamics and spikes. We know the brain uses them. For now, spiking neural network and dynamical neural networks are not state-of-the-art, but we know that they give really interesting feature. And so this is why, even though we don't yet know very well how to use them, many people are trying to implement them in their systems, because, I mean, AI algorithms are changing so fast that we know that at some point they will become useful. Now, why is spintronics useful for neuromorphic computing? This is because it can give a lot of solutions to this challenge that I've just mentioned. Spintronics is a very multifunctional physical system technology. And so it opens the possibility to make all the building blocks with a single technology and CMOS. So what do I mean? Is that first, magnetic tunnel junction can bring large amounts of memory on chip, which, as we have seen, is very important for low power computing. So now all the major foundries have demonstrated that they can integrate magnetic tunnel junctions in their standard lines. So there are prototypes of gigabits of magnetic random access memory, which means that you can have already billions of magnetic tunnel junctions on a chip integrated in CMOS, which provides this huge amount of non-volatile memory with a high endurance and reproducibility. So of course, yes, the first function of spintronics for neuromorphic computing is this ability to just bring binary memory on chip. But then you know that spintronics has many other interesting features. So first, spintronics is based on magnetization dynamics. So it provides non-linearity and dynamics as in the brain. So you can have these non-linear oscillators, for example. Here you see the output. Also, spintronics is by essence sensitive to thermal effects, and you can use these thermal effects to induce some controllable stochasticity that is very also similar to things that are observed in the brain. And you can use magnetic textures to implement more complex functions. And so here, these are just some kind of trying to give you some ideas of all the things that you can do with spintronics. But basically, yes, the idea is that you can imagine to use only CMOS spintronic nano devices and implement all the functions that you want on a chip. Now, of course, there are so many possibilities that it's a very, let's say, exploratory and exploding fields going in all directions, but it's normal at the beginning. We need to explore all this. So I'm going to try to give you a quick overview of what people are doing today. So first, there's been some implementation of synapses with spintronics. So as I said, the first thing you can do is simply to replace the SRAM's memory of CMOS with spin-torque MRAMs. Okay, so it means that you make a neuromorphic chip as they do in CMOS, but you replace the memory building block. And this can already really reduce the power consumption of CMOS, neuromorphic chips. There are beautiful results from the group in Tohoku University, where they have obtained very, very low power image recognition. Now, the challenge for these chips is really to scale them up and demonstrate state-of-the-art learning algorithms with backprop. These are associative memories, which are a bit older concept. And so what would be really interesting is to demonstrate low power computing with state-of-the-art algorithms. Okay. Now, in this case, what we are doing is that simply the synaptic weight is a real number translated into a 32-bit floating point, then that is written in an STM RAM. Okay, so it's not like you have one device for one synapse. But you can do that with spintronics because in order to make some kind of memory store, what you can do to go beyond this binary switching that you see here and obtain some multi-level conductance state, what you can do is use magnetic textures. So, for example, if you take a spin valve or a magnetic tunnel junctions and in one of the ferromagnetic layer, you have a domain wall. When you move this domain wall, you're going to, it's like a cursor between the parallel and anti-parallel state. And so you are going to change, if you can stabilize this domain wall at different positions, you're going to change the conductance in an analog way. Same thing here in this nice paper, you see that if you have a device where you nucleate several different densities of skyrmions, it's the same, you're going to change the resistance in an analog way. So you have a synaptic-like behavior. And here, this is a heavy metal anti-ferromagnet system where what's happening is that because of the grains in the anti-ferromagnet, you are switching the magnetization little by little. So here again, you have an analog device. So this means that using magnetic textures, you can implement memory stores with spintronics. A nice result of the group in Tohoku has been to show that such synapses here can learn through spike timing dependent plasticity. So you remember this learning rule here. So the way spike timing dependent plasticity is achieved often in neuromorphic chips where you have a memory store is through the overlap of neural spikes. So when you have a memory store, you have these characteristics that I showed you before, and you have this threshold of voltage when the voltage is small, you don't change the resistance. When it's high, when it's above the threshold, you change the resistance. So what people do in order to make spike timing dependent plasticity is that they use a very special neural shape like this, and with an amplitude that is below the threshold for writing the resistance. So you see that here you have two neurons. They have this voltage shape. So the voltage across the device here, across the memory store, is the difference between these two voltages. So you see that with these special shapes, if the pre-neuron spikes and the post-neuron spikes, when you plot the difference between these two voltages, you're going to obtain this particular response. And you see that it's positive and it can go over the threshold. And so it's going to increase the resistance. On the contrary, when you have the post-neuron that spikes first and then the pre-neuron, the superposition is going to give you a negative pulse across the memory store, so you're going to decrease the conductance. So this gives you the spike time independent plasticity. And so it has been shown to work. These are experimental demonstration with oxide memory stores. And if you change the pulse shape, you can really change your spike time independent plasticity response. This is an experiment, and it really looks like biology. But it's a bit artificial because you really need some very specific pulse shape here. So what people have proposed is that instead of using a superposition of complex pulses to write your memory store, you could instead use temperature effects. So the idea here is that is to use devices that are sensitive, where the conductance change are going to be driven by voltages, but facilitated by an increase of temperature. So the idea is that, imagine you have a device like that and you send a voltage pulse. The device is going to respond a bit because the temperature is going to increase, but that it's going to cool down and nothing happens. And then when you send another spike, it starts again, okay? But if you send the voltage spikes very fast one after the other, the device doesn't have time to cool down between the two spikes. And so when the second spike arrives, the device is already thermally activated. And so it's going then to kind of, the two spikes are going to complement each other and can induce a switch, okay? And so you see that when you use temperature, the time between pulses is going to be very important to determine the change of the resistance. And it has been shown that you can implement spike time independent plasticity with this kind of effects. And this is what the Tohoku group has shown recently. This is a STDP curve, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it's a very nice experiment. Now for neurons, there are many ways to implement neurons with spintronics. First possibility, if you want to do some spiking neuron, is to use superparamagnetic tunnel junction. So this is the typical evolution of a spiking neuron. Here you would have the voltage as a function of time, and you see the spikes. And what happens is that it's known that these spikes are not, well, they do not seem to be reproducible. There is a lot of variability. When you have biological neurons in a Petri dish and you send them the same inputs exactly, they are never going to spike exactly the same, so you have some stochasticity. So, and it seems that this rate is important. And so the idea to imitate this with superparamagnetic tunnel junction is to make junctions that are so small or with materials that are so smooth that the barrier between the parallel and the anti-parallel cells, the energy barrier, is going to be low enough that the magnetization can really switch through thermal fluctuations. So when you measure the resistance as a function of time, here you see this telegraphic switching that really resembles this spiking behavior. And what is interesting is that this is some kind of random number generator, but through spin torque, you can tune it. So when you apply a positive voltage or a negative voltage, you know that the spin torque will favor the P state or the AP state. So you are going to change the probability of switching. Here it wants to be more in the P state, here it wants to be more in the AP state. So you can control your spike train if you want. And what is interesting is that if you plot the rate of switch, you're going to, you see here frequency is high, here it's low, here it's low. So you are going to have a rate as a function of voltage that is going to have this bell-shaped curve that actually has been observed for many types of sensory neurons in the brain. So this is interesting for neuromorphic computing. So there are many different ways to compute that have been explored in these papers. And I'm not going to go into details. So this is if you want to kind of imitate spiking neurons. Now, if you want to have a more abstract view of neurons, you remember that all you need to do is to have some kind of nonlinearity. So an example, for example, it has been proposed to use the pinned Skyrmion structures to implement such nonlinearity. So these are computations by the group of Karin Evershaw-Sitter in Mainz. And she has studied how, when you have a spin Skyrmion, then you apply some driving force, for example, through a current or voltage, the Skyrmion is going to leave its spinning potential and do some trajectory. And then when the force is set back to zero, reset, the Skyrmion is going to come back. And these motions are going to be nonlinear, and they are going to give rise to nonlinear resistance variations. So this, in a way, can imitate a neuron. And why it's interesting is that because then if you have a Skyrmion's texture, that you apply some voltage inputs to it, you can see it as some kind of neural network where all the Skyrmions are neurons that are moving in a complex nonlinear ways. So in that case, it's difficult to define a synapse and to tune these synapses, but there are some approaches of neural networks where synapses are fixed, and what you are using is the complex dynamics of the neurons. And so this is what they have proposed and simulated in this paper. And so the advantage here is that it's very elegant because the texture is your neural network. And another possibility that we are studying heavily in my group is to use spintronic nano-oscillator as radio frequency neurons. So as you know, when you put a DC current in a magnetic tunnel junction, there are some configurations where you can induce a steady precession of the magnetization. So when you measure the voltage across the device, this is an experiment here, you see some very nice oscillation as a function of time. And what is interesting is that this occurs in the nanosecond time scale, so at frequencies that, depending on your material or the geometry, can go between 10 of megahertz to dozens of gigahertz. And also, so this is a microwave signal. And because the strength of the DC current, so the strength of the spin torque is going to determine the orbit of precession, the microwave power that is emitted depends on the DC. And this is an experiment. You see how the emitted power evolves with the DC input. First, when you don't have enough spin torque, the magnetization does not move. Then at some point above a threshold, it's going to start rotating and the emitted power increases. And you see that this looks very much like the activation function of a neuron. It is this rectified nonlinear unit. And so what it means is that you can see spin torque nano-oscillators as radio frequency neurons. They take the current as an input, they apply to it an activation function that is nonlinear, and not only do they do that, but they transform it in a radio frequency signal that can then potentially be broadcast to other neurons. So this is very interesting to connect a lot of neurons together. Here we are using in our experiments devices that are about 500 nanometer in diameter. So this is why we need huge DC currents. But in principle, if we scale them down, we can really reduce the power consumption down to microwatts. And we have shown in the recent years that these neurons actually powerful enough to perform some neuromorphic tasks in these two papers. And we have also shown that we can use these radio frequencies signal to connect several layers of neurons. So, okay, so I'm going to conclude my talk with this interconnection issue. So you see what I'm saying here is that spintronics can help to make nanosynapses. This is what we have seen, and nanoneurons, right? But then once you have all these devices, you need to connect them together, and you need a large number of connections. You see, this is the brain. You have the cut of the neurons, and you see all the wires to connect them together. This is something really crazy. So this is going to be very difficult to do with our electronics, right? We typically do straight wires, and it's still difficult to go 3D with standard electronics. So it's good to try to think how we can smartly connect together all these devices. And so I'm going to skip a lot, but what I want to say is that I think spintronics really offers some possibilities, because we have seen already that you have these solitons that can move, like domain walls and skyrmions. So these are some kind of tiny bits of memories that you could send in a neural network to connect them, you know, that you could be transmitted between different units. You can connect, spintronic nano devices can emit spin waves that can also go into the different direction and connect devices together. Microwaves can be used. This is what we are trying to do. And also spintronics can go 3D. And so this is very interesting. And so I'm going to skip this and go to really my conclusion. So what it means is that using spintronics with CMOS, we can implement multiple functionalities with only one memory technology on a chip. So we could imagine to have oscillations, memory, random number generators, and connect different chips with microwave. We can go 3D, and something that I didn't mention yet, but not only spintronic nano devices emit signals that can enable them to communicate, but they also are able to collect signals. You know that they are very good sensors. So they could natively receive signals, for example, for energy harvesting, to try to give power from the outside world to these networks. And also they could potentially classify natively the signals that they receive from the outside world. And the signals can be currents, thermal fluctuations, microwave signals, so on and so forth. The challenges and disadvantages of spintronics for neuromorphic computing. We have seen that what's nice is the multifunctionality, but taking advantage of all these functionalities requires an interdisciplinary approach. This is complicated, but this is cool. Something that is not good is that magnetic tunnel junctions are very low off-on ratio, smaller than 3. This prevents building purely resistive crossbar arrays. But this is not a fundamental limit. The TMR should, in theory, could be much larger. So this is explored today. And also, there is a low efficiency of spin charge conversion. And again, this is not a fundamental limit. And as you know, people are working a lot in this area. So this is going to improve in the future. And it's a field in constant progress. So yes, I think there are many ways in which spintronics in the future will improve its abilities for neuromorphic computing, and especially I think that increasing the speed of computing, going from gigahertz to terahertz, can be very, very interesting. And I will conclude on this slide because it's really the end of my talk. I am over time, so I'm not going to comment. I'm going to leave it here. That compares spintronics with other different approaches to neuromorphic computing. Yes, and so really, I think the advantage is the multifunctionality, all the possibilities to interconnect these devices, the sensing possibilities, and the endurance, of course, of the device. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Actually, during your talk, I realized that I haven't introduced you. So let me just say
it doesn't matter.
Words. But I mean, there are two words that have to be seen about you, because I know you already for quite a few years. Julie is an absolute pioneer of the neuromorphic computing. She has created this idea of the spin torque oscillators and doing neuromorphics with it. And she has pursued it for many years. She has been funded by ERC twice with this idea, and she has succeeded, right? And so she's probably, I mean, she's a world-class expert in this matter, and we were so much I wanted to say not happy. Actually, the right word does not come to me. I mean, it was a real privilege to having you here talking about this today, and thank you very much. And please apologize that I didn't introduce you properly.
No, actually, right? No, it's good to go to the matter directly.
Okay, so there is time now for questions. There is an application. I mean, probably people have used this already during this school. For me, it was actually the first time, but it's not very complicated. So there is a few questions already. On the search of artificial neurons, which are the category of phenomena capable of producing spiking? I mean, other than spin torque oscillators, what would you request to a phenomenon to use it for neutron replication?
So I'm not sure I understand. Is the question how to make spiking neuron with spintronics? Or
no, without, I mean, with any other phenomenon? I mean, could, for example, ferroelectrics be used for this, or I mean, whatever other phenomenon?
Yes, so in CMOS, what people do is to use capacitors to integrate the signals. That's the membrane potential, and then they use some transistors to make it spike when it overcomes the threshold. And this is why it's big, because a capacitor it takes a lot of area. There are some types of memristors that are volatile. In fact, in that case, they are volatile because their switching is induced by is really helped by temperature. So when you remove the voltage, it tends to go back to its initial state. And this kind of memristors, they have what is called a negative differential resistance, and you can use negative differential resistance to implement oscillations actually. So you can make spiking memristors actually. So if you add the capacitor and things like that. And so they are very interesting, of course. And there is a lot of research on that. We are also studying them in the lab. And I think so I didn't have time to cover everything today. And there are some proposals to do some spiking spintronic neurons. For example, in the group of Andrei Slavin, they propose to use terahertz, to use antiferromagnets, the response of antiferromagnets. Yes, because there is another system that is interesting for spikes. Of course, it's Josephson junctions. Naturally emit, flux units, if you want. So that's the equivalent of spikes. And there are some conditions in which Landau-Lifshitz-Gilbert equation can be rewritten as the Josephson equation, actually. And so this is the case for antiferromagnets and other systems. Possibilities.
Okay. And a different question. Okay, so we have here, apart from energy consumption considerations, where a neuromorphic artificial intelligence would surpass software artificial intelligence on usual computing architecture, is there an intrinsic advantage? Could neuromorphic artificial intelligence maybe fastest, optimal, more distributed, not just cheapest, which is already a lot?
It's a good question, and it's difficult to answer because what we call software artificial intelligence is actually running on current hardware, and the algorithms that exist today are designed to run on this hardware. And one of the reasons we have all this progress of AI recently is not that the algorithms are new because they were invented in the 80s, is because finally there was some GPUs to run them. So it's a belief, but it's my belief at least, and I think of many others, that if we are able to make denser neural network with more synapses and with dynamics, at some point there will be some algorithm to run on them, and they will be more powerful because they will be closer to the brain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. There is one more question. Could you give us some numbers? What is the level of interneuron connectivity in artificial neurons as compared to the human brain? Is this a bottleneck in neuromorphic computing?
Yes, again, it's a bit the same answer. So people are doing what they can. There are many different types of neural networks also, and the connectivity varies a lot. So in convolutional neural networks, you have low connectivity because what you are doing is that you use, when you process an image, you use only a small part of the image. But there are some neural networks that are totally connected and that can have 10,000 synapses per neuron in software. So it's difficult to say. And again, that's one of the hard points in this field, is that algorithms are changing so fast that you need to kind of think ahead on the hardware that you do, because the time scale of development are very different. So, really in the cortex, which is where we believe is our rational thinking and human capability, the neocortex, this is where you have this dense connectivity, 10,000 synapses per neuron. So, and it makes sense that it's important because then you have more parameters that you can play with, right? So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me see. Okay, there is one more question. In spiking neural networks, one can distinguish latency coding and frequency coding. Are the frequency coding compatible with the STDP that you are describing?
So, yes, it's true. So when you are, that's the advantages of spikes. You can use both of these. Spike time independent plasticity is typically interested in latency coding. But I mean, so if you produce, for example, if you use super paramagnetic tunnel junctions, you are going to be using frequency coding. Frequency coding is a transposition of today's artificial intelligence, and latency coding is still to be explored for gradient descent and high performance computing, but there is a lot of work currently in this area. Big progress. So.
Okay, and in trying to make artificial neurons, to emulate neurons, how important is that the phenomenon that you're using is fast? I mean, how important is the time scale of a phenomenon to replicate a neuron?
Yes, okay, so very good question. So in the brain, everything works at the millisecond time scale. So every device is rather slow. And the reason we are fast is that we are hugely parallel, massively parallel neural network. So the answer is, if you are able to build a hugely parallel neural network, you can be slow, but if you are not, which I guess would be the case at the beginning, it's better to have fast devices to try to compensate somehow for that.
Thank you very much. So I don't see any more questions. So please give the speaker an applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
It was really a pleasure having you here around.
Thanks.
Okay, so